Let yourself settle in comfortably as we journey back through thousands of years to one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, a land where dynasties rose and fell like the changing seasons, where emperors built walls that stretched across horizons, and where philosophy, art, and innovation flourished for millennia. Close your eyes and breathe deeply as we explore the vast and ancient history of China, a story that spans over 4,000 years of recorded history and touches every aspect of human achievement. The story of Chinese civilization begins along two great rivers that have shaped the land and its people for countless generations. The Yellow River, known as the Huanghe, flows for 3,395 miles through northern China, earning its name from the yellow, silted carries from the Loess Plateau. This river, often called China's Sorrow because of its devastating floods, is also known as the cradle of Chinese civilization because the earliest Chinese settlements emerged along its fertile banks. To the south, the Yangtze River, stretching 3,917 miles, is the longest river in Asia and has nurtured civilization in southern China for just as long. These two rivers created the geographic and agricultural conditions that allowed early Chinese culture to develop and flourish, providing water for irrigation, transportation for trade, and rich soil deposits that made farming possible. Breathe slowly now as we consider the legendary origins of Chinese civilization, for Chinese history begins with mythology that gradually blends into historical record. According to tradition, Chinese civilization was founded by the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, legendary sage kings who ruled in the distant past. The most famous of these is the Yellow Emperor Huang Di, said to have reigned around 2697 BC, who is credited with introducing many elements of Chinese culture, including writing, the calendar, medicine, and governmental organization. While these figures are legendary rather than historical, they represent the Chinese understanding of their own cultural origins and have been venerated throughout Chinese history as the ancestors of the Chinese people. The line between myth and history in ancient China is deliberately blurred, with later dynasties tracing their legitimacy back to these legendary founders. Let your mind drift to the first dynasty with archaeological evidence to support its existence, the Tang Dynasty, which ruled approximately from 1600 to 1046 BC in the Yellow River Valley. The Shang capital at Anyang has yielded thousands of artifacts that confirm this dynasty's historical reality. The Shang developed the earliest form of Chinese writing, carving characters onto oracle bones, animal bones, and turtle shells that were heated until they cracked, with the cracks then read by diviners to answer questions about the future, military campaigns, or agricultural planning. These oracle bone inscriptions, numbering over 150,000 discovered fragments, represent the oldest substantial body of Chinese writing and provide invaluable information about Shang society, religion, and government. The Shang dynasty was a Bronze Age civilization that created magnificent bronze vessels used in religious ceremonies, many decorated with intricate designs and inscriptions that showcase remarkable artistic and technical sophistication. Now breathe deeply and picture the Zhou dynasty, which overthrew the Shang around 1046 BC and established a dynasty that would last longer than any other in Chinese history, until 256 BC, nearly 800 years, though the Zhou's real power waned considerably after 771 BC. The Zhou introduced the concept of the mandate of heaven, a revolutionary political and philosophical idea that would shape Chinese political thought for the next 3,000 years. According to this concept, heaven granted the emperor the right to rule based on his virtue and ability to govern well. If a ruler became corrupt or tyrannical, heaven would withdraw its mandate, justifying rebellion and the establishment of a new dynasty. This created a cyclical view of history where dynasties rose through virtue and fell through corruption, only to be replaced by a new dynasty that had gained heaven's favor. The mandate of heaven transformed rebellion from mere lawlessness into a potentially moral and cosmically sanctioned act, fundamentally shaping how Chinese people understood political legitimacy and change. Let yourself relax as we explore the later Zhou period, particularly the era known as the Spring and Autumn period, 770 to 476 BC, and the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BC. During these centuries, the Zhou dynasty's power collapsed, and China fragmented into numerous rival states that constantly warred with each other for supremacy. This was an age of tremendous violence and political chaos, with states conquering and absorbing each other, armies growing larger and more sophisticated, and warfare becoming more brutal. Yet paradoxically, this period of turmoil was also China's greatest age of philosophical flowering. The instability and suffering prompted thinkers to grapple with fundamental questions about human nature, ethics, governance, and the proper ordering of society. It was during this period that China's 100 schools of thought emerged, with competing philosophies offering different answers to the crisis facing Chinese civilization. Breathe slowly and contemplate Confucius, the most influential philosopher in Chinese history, who lived from 551 to 479 BC during the Spring and Autumn period. Confucius, whose name in Chinese is Kongzi or Kongfuzi, Master Kong, came from a minor noble family in the state of Lu and spent much of his life traveling between states, seeking a ruler who would implement his ideas for creating a harmonious society. Confucius taught that social harmony could be achieved through proper relationships based on benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and filial piety. He emphasized the importance of education, ritual, and moral self-cultivation. His teachings were collected by his disciples in the Analects, a text that would become one of the foundational classics of Chinese culture. Though Confucius died believing himself a failure, with no ruler having fully adopted his teachings, his philosophy would eventually become the dominant ideology of imperial China, shaping government, education, and social relationships for over 2,000 years. Confucianism emphasized hierarchy and harmony, teaching that a well-ordered society required everyone to fulfill their roles properly. Rulers to govern benevolently, subjects to obey loyally, parents to nurture lovingly, and children to respect filially. Now let your thoughts drift to Laozi, the legendary founder of Taoism, who supposedly lived during the 6th century BC, though his historical existence is uncertain and the text attributed to him, the Deidejing, or Classic of the Way and Virtue, was probably compiled over several centuries. Taoism offered a stark contrast to Confucianism's emphasis on social roles and education. Instead, Taoism taught that harmony came from aligning oneself with the Tao of the Way, an ineffable cosmic principle underlying all existence. The Deidejing advocates simplicity, spontaneity, and wu-wei, often translated as non-action, but better understood as effortless action in harmony with natural patterns, where Confucius emphasized active moral cultivation and engagement with society. Taoism suggested that human attempts to impose order often created more problems than they solved, and that wisdom lay in understanding and flowing with natural processes. These two philosophies would coexist throughout Chinese history, with Confucianism dominating official government and public life, while Taoism influenced art, poetry, medicine, and personal spirituality, creating a complementary duality at the heart of Chinese culture. The Warring States period also saw the emergence of legalism, a philosophy that would prove crucial in unifying China. Legalist philosophers like Confucius argued that human nature was inherently selfish and that order could only be maintained through strict laws enforced by severe punishments and generous rewards. Legalism rejected the Confucian emphasis on moral education and the Taoist preference for minimal government, instead advocating for a powerful centralized state with clear laws, efficient bureaucracy, and absolute authority concentrated in the ruler. While legalism was rejected by later Chinese thinkers as too harsh and immoral, it provided the philosophical foundation for the state of Qin, which would use legalist principles to create the most powerful military and administrative system of the Warring States period, ultimately conquering all rival states and establishing China's first truly unified empire. As you rest, imagine ancient China, a land of countless states locked in endless warfare, philosophers debating in dusty courtyards, scribes inscribing bamboo strips with revolutionary ideas, armies massing on distant borders, and through it all, two great rivers flowing eternally through the heart of Chinese civilization, carrying the silt of centuries, nurturing the fields, connecting the people, bearing witness to the birth of one of humanity's greatest and most enduring cultures. Let your breathing slow as we witness the rise of the Qin dynasty, the state that would finally end centuries of warfare and create a unified Chinese empire. The state of Qin, located in the western region of China, adopted legalist principles more thoroughly than any other state, creating an efficient and ruthless government that organized its population for maximum military and economic productivity. Through a series of brilliant military campaigns, the Qin conquered all rival states, and in 221 BC, the king of Qin took a new title never before used in Chinese history, Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Qin. This marked the true beginning of imperial China, transforming a collection of warring states into a unified empire under a single ruler. The term China itself derives from Qin, the dynasty that first united the land. Now, let your thoughts drift to the first emperor's ambitious program of standardization, for unification meant more than just military conquest. Qin Shi Huangdi implemented sweeping reforms to create cultural and administrative unity across his vast empire. He standardized weights and measures, ensuring that commerce could flow smoothly across former state boundaries. He standardized the currency, replacing the various coins and forms of money used by different states with the single copper coin system. Most significantly, he standardized the Chinese writing system, mandating that all characters be written in a uniform style called small seal script. This standardization of writing was crucial because while spoken Chinese varied greatly across regions, and still does today, a uniform written language allowed educated people from different areas to communicate in writing even if they couldn't understand each other's speech. The first emperor also standardized the axle width of carts, ensuring that they would all fit in the same wheel ruts on roads, facilitating transportation across the empire. Breathe deeply and picture the most famous of the first emperor's projects, the Great Wall of China. The wall we know today is largely a Ming Dynasty construction built over 1,000 years later, but the first emperor initiated the project by connecting and extending earlier defensive walls built by various warring states. He mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers, soldiers, peasants, and prisoners to build a fortification that would protect China's northern border from nomadic invasions. The construction was brutal, with countless workers dying from exhaustion, accidents, and harsh conditions. Legends say that workers who died were buried within the wall itself, though archaeological evidence doesn't support this. The Qin-era wall stretched approximately 3,000 miles, far shorter than the later Ming Wall, but it represented an extraordinary feat of engineering and organization, demonstrating the emperor's ability to mobilize resources on an unprecedented scale. Let yourself relax as we explore one of history's most remarkable archaeological discoveries, the Terracotta Army. This vast underground army of life-sized clay soldiers was created to guard the first emperor in death, buried near his tomb outside the ancient capital of Xi'an. The army consists of approximately 8,000 soldiers, 130 chariots with 520 horses, and 150 cavalry horses, each figure individually crafted with unique facial features, expressions, and details. The soldiers were originally painted in bright colors and carried real weapons. They were arranged in military formation in 3 large pits, representing a full imperial guard. The existence of this underground army was completely unknown until 1974, when farmers digging a well accidentally broke through to one of the pits. The discovery revealed not only the emperor's obsession with immortality and power, but also provided invaluable information about Qin military organization, weaponry, and artistic capabilities. The Terracotta Army stands as one of the most spectacular archaeological finds in human history. Now, breathe slowly and contemplate the harsh rule of the first emperor and the rapid collapse of his dynasty. Qin Shi Huangdi ruled with absolute authority and paranoid severity. He burned books he considered dangerous, particularly Confucian texts that emphasized moral criticism of rulers, in the infamous burning of the books in 213 BC. He ordered the execution of hundreds of scholars who defied him in what became known as the burial of the scholars. His massive construction projects, the Great Wall, his enormous tomb, roads, and palaces, required forced labor that created tremendous suffering among the population. When he died in 210 BC during a tour of his empire, his advisors concealed his death for weeks, fearing instability. His son, the second emperor, was weak and incompetent. Within 4 years of the first emperor's death, the Qin dynasty collapsed in rebellion and civil war, lasting only 15 years total. Yet despite its brevity, the Qin dynasty fundamentally transformed China, establishing the template of a unified empire under a centralized bureaucracy that would persist for over 2,000 years. Let your mind drift to the Han Dynasty, which emerged from the chaos following the Qin collapse and ruled from 206 BC to 220 AD, with a brief interruption, a span of over 400 years that consolidated and refined the imperial system. The Han Dynasty is so important to Chinese identity that even today, the majority ethnic group in China calls itself Han Chinese. The dynasty's founder, Liu Bang, was a commoner who rose through military leadership during the rebellions against Qin. As Emperor Gaozu, he established a dynasty that would retain the centralized structure of the Qin state, but govern with less severity, softening legalist harshness with Confucian principles. The Han Dynasty saw China reach new heights of prosperity, territorial expansion, and cultural achievement, creating what many consider the classical period of Chinese civilization. Breathe deeply as we explore the reign of Emperor Wu of Han, who ruled from 141 to 87 BC and transformed China into a true empire. Emperor Wu aggressively expanded Han territory, conquering lands in the south, modern Vietnam, the northeast, Korea, and the West, Central Asia, nearly doubling the size of the empire. He established Confucianism as the official state ideology, creating an examination system to select government officials based on their knowledge of Confucian classics rather than their birth or military prowess. This examination system, refined over centuries, would become one of the defining features of Chinese government, theoretically allowing talented men from any background to enter civil service. Emperor Wu also sent envoys westward, most famously Zhang Qian, whose expeditions to Central Asia opened what would become known as the Silk Road, establishing trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean world and would facilitate the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture across Eurasia for over 1,000 years. The Silk Road deserves quiet contemplation as you drift toward deeper rest. This network of trade routes, stretching over 4,000 miles from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean, carried far more than just silk, though that luxurious Chinese fabric gave the route its name. Caravans transported spices, precious stones, metals, glass, ceramics, paper, and countless other goods. Buddhist missionaries traveled eastward along these routes, bringing their religion to China, where it would become deeply integrated into Chinese culture. Ideas, technologies, and artistic styles flowed in both directions. Chinese inventions like paper gradually spread westward, while Western goods and ideas traveled east. The Silk Road created the first truly global exchange network, connecting civilizations that had previously existed in isolation and demonstrating that even in ancient times, human societies were interconnected through trade, cultural exchange, and the restless human desire to see what lies beyond the horizon. As you sink deeper into rest, imagine caravans of camels laden with silk traversing windswept deserts, merchants haggling in languages neither fully understands, monks carrying scrolls of sacred texts across mountain passes, and distant courts receiving exotic goods from the ends of the earth, all connected by these ancient roads that stitched together the known world, making distant strangers into trading partners, transforming Chinese civilization from an isolated kingdom into a power that touched the entire ancient world. Let your breathing deepen as we explore the 4 great inventions of ancient China, innovations that would fundamentally alter human civilization and eventually spread across the world. The first was paper, invented during the Han Dynasty around 105 AD by Kai Luan, a court official who created a method of making paper from tree bark, hemp, rags, and fishing nets. Before paper, the Chinese wrote on bamboo strips or expensive silk, but paper provided a lightweight, affordable writing surface that revolutionized record-keeping, literature, and the spread of knowledge. The invention of paper would eventually reach the Islamic world by the 8th century and Europe by the 12th century, making books more accessible and facilitating the preservation and transmission of human knowledge on an unprecedented scale. Now, let your thoughts drift to the invention of printing, which emerged during the Tang Dynasty around the 7th century AD. The Chinese developed woodblock printing, where text and images were carved in reverse onto wooden blocks, inked, and then pressed onto paper. The oldest surviving printed book is the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text printed in 868 AD, nearly 6 centuries before Gutenberg's printing press in Europe. During the Song Dynasty in the 11th century, a commoner named Sheng invented movable type, printing using ceramic characters that could be rearranged and reused, though this innovation didn't become as widespread in China as woodblock printing due to the complexity of the Chinese writing system with its thousands of characters. Nevertheless, Chinese printing technology transformed education, religion, and government by making texts reproducible on a scale never before possible. Breathe slowly and picture the invention of gunpowder, which emerged from Taoist alchemists' experiments during the Tang Dynasty around the 9th century. These alchemists were seeking the elixir of immortality, mixing various substances to create medicines that might extend life. Instead, they discovered that a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal created a violently explosive compound. Initially used for fireworks and signals, gunpowder was weaponized by the Tang Dynasty, which developed fire lances, bombs, rockets, and eventually the first true guns and cannons. This military technology would spread westward along the Silk Road, reaching the Islamic world and Europe, where it would revolutionize warfare, making medieval castles and armored knights obsolete, and fundamentally changing the nature of military conflict and political power. Let yourself relax as we contemplate the fourth great invention, the compass. Chinese scientists discovered that lodestone, a naturally magnetized iron ore, would align itself with Earth's magnetic field. By the Tang Dynasty around the 11th century, the Chinese had developed the magnetic compass for navigation, initially using it for geomancy and feng shui before recognizing its maritime applications. Chinese ships equipped with compasses could navigate confidently even when the sun and stars were hidden by clouds, enabling safer and more ambitious sea voyages. The compass technology spread to the Islamic world and Europe, where it became essential for the age of exploration, allowing European navigators to cross vast oceans and eventually circumnavigate the globe. These four inventions, paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass, represent China's profound contributions to human technological development. Now breathe deeply and contemplate the fall of the Han Dynasty in 220 AD, which plunged China into nearly 4 centuries of division and conflict known as the period of disunion. The Han Dynasty weakened gradually through internal corruption, court intrigues, powerful regional warlords, peasant rebellions, and invasions by nomadic peoples from the north. When the dynasty finally collapsed, China fragmented into competing kingdoms. The immediate aftermath was the Three Kingdoms period, 220 to 280 AD, when 3 rival states, Wei in the north, Shu in the southwest, and Wu in the southeast, battled for supremacy. This era, despite its violence and instability, became one of the most romanticized periods in Chinese history, immortalized in the classical novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, filled with tales of heroic warriors, cunning strategists, and tragic loyalty. The period represents in Chinese cultural memory a time of chaos, but also of individual honor and dramatic human conflict. Let your mind drift to the profound changes in Chinese religion and philosophy during this period of disunion. Buddhism, which had entered China along the Silk Road during the Han Dynasty, flourished during these troubled centuries as people sought spiritual solace amid political chaos. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning, art, and sanctuary, while Buddhist philosophy offered explanations for suffering and paths to transcendence that resonated with people experiencing the collapse of their ordered world. Buddhism adapted to Chinese culture, blending with Taoist concepts to create distinctly Chinese forms like Chan Buddhism, later known as Zen in Japan. The great Buddhist cave temples at Mogao, Longmen, and Yungang were carved during this period, filled with thousands of statues and murals that represent some of the finest religious art ever created. By the time China was reunified, Buddhism had become deeply embedded in Chinese culture, existing alongside Confucianism and Taoism in a harmonious plurality that enriched Chinese spiritual and intellectual life. Breathe slowly as we witness China's reunification under the Sui dynasty, which emerged in 581 AD after nearly 4 centuries of division. The Sui dynasty was short-lived, lasting only from 581 to 618 AD, but it accomplished crucial achievements that laid the foundation for the following dynasty's golden age. The most significant was the construction of the Grand Canal, an enormous engineering project that connected the Yellow River in the north with the Yangtze River in the south. This canal, stretching eventually to over 1,100 miles, created a vital north-south transportation route that unified China economically, allowing grain from the fertile south to feed the armies and bureaucracy in the north, and facilitating trade and communication across the empire. The Grand Canal remains the longest ancient canal in the world and is still in use today. However, the massive construction projects and costly military campaigns of the Sui emperors, particularly the disastrous invasions of Korea, exhausted the treasury and alienated the population, leading to the dynasty's rapid collapse in rebellion and civil war. The Tang Dynasty, which seized power in 618 AD, would rule for nearly 3 centuries until 907 AD, creating what many consider the golden age of Chinese civilization. The Tang capital at Chang'an, modern Xi'an, became the largest city in the world, with over 1 million inhabitants, a cosmopolitan metropolis that attracted merchants, scholars, diplomats, and pilgrims from across Asia and beyond. Tang China reached the height of its power and cultural brilliance under emperors like Taizong and Xuanzong, expanding Chinese territory westward into Central Asia, south into Vietnam, and northeast into Korea. The Tang Dynasty saw unprecedented achievements in poetry, with masters like Li Bai and Du Fu creating works that remain central to Chinese literature. Tang ceramic art, particularly the famous 3-color glazed pottery called Sankai, achieved new levels of sophistication and beauty. The imperial examination system was refined and expanded, creating a true meritocracy in theory, if not always in practice. Tang China was wealthy, confident, and culturally vibrant, setting standards of civilization that would influence all of East Asia, and that Chinese people would look back on with nostalgia for centuries. As you rest in deep tranquility, imagine Tang Dynasty Chang'an, broad avenues filled with merchants from Persia, monks from India, envoys from Japan, the sounds of a dozen languages mixing in the marketplace, poets gathering in garden pavilions to compose verses and drink wine, the emperor's palace rising in splendor at the city's heart, and across the empire, scribes copying Buddhist sutras, farmers tending rice paddies that fed millions, and along the Silk Road, endless caravans carrying the products of Chinese civilization to the distant corners of the known world. Let your breathing slow as we explore the remarkable reign of China's only female emperor, Wu Zetian, who ruled during the Tang Dynasty from 690 to 705 AD. Wu Zetian began as a concubine to Emperor Taizong, then became consort to his son Emperor Gaozong, and after Gaozong's death, she effectively ruled through her sons before finally declaring herself emperor of a new dynasty she called Zhou. In a patriarchal society that considered women unsuitable for political power, Wu Zetian's ascension was revolutionary and controversial. She ruled with intelligence and ruthlessness, using secret police and informants to eliminate rivals, while also promoting capable officials based on merit regardless of their background. She expanded the examination system, patronized Buddhism extensively, and maintained stable government and prosperity. Though Confucian historians later condemned her as a usurper, Modern scholarship recognizes her as a capable and effective ruler who held power during a critical period of Tang history, demonstrating that competence in governance was not determined by gender. Now, let your thoughts drift to the Lushan Rebellion, a catastrophic civil war that erupted in 755 AD and nearly destroyed the Tang Dynasty. Lushan was a general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic ancestry who commanded the Tang armies on the northern frontier. In 755 AD, he rebelled against the emperor, capturing the capital Chang'an and declaring himself emperor of a new dynasty. Emperor Xuanzong fled, and his favorite consort Yang Guifei, blamed by many for the crisis, was forced to commit suicide. The rebellion lasted 8 years and devastated northern China, with estimates suggesting that the population of China dropped by tens of millions, though whether through death, displacement, or census disruption remains debated. Though the Tang Dynasty eventually suppressed the rebellion and survived for another century and a half, it never recovered its former glory. Regional military governors gained autonomy, the central government weakened, and the dynasty limped toward its eventual collapse in 907 AD, ending the Tang Golden Age and plunging China once again into division. Breathe deeply and picture the Song Dynasty, which reunified most of China in 960 AD after a half-century of division following the Tang collapse. The Song Dynasty, lasting until 1279 AD, never achieved the military dominance or territorial extent of the Tang, constantly struggling against powerful nomadic neighbors and eventually losing control of northern China to foreign invaders. However, the Song Dynasty presided over perhaps the most economically and technologically advanced society in the world at that time. The Song period saw remarkable innovations. The perfection of woodblock printing led to an explosion of books and literacy. Paper money was invented to facilitate commerce. Gunpowder weapons became more sophisticated, and the compass enabled the development of a powerful naval trade network. The Song government collected more revenue than any previous Chinese dynasty, not through conquest, but through commerce, taxation, and efficient administration, demonstrating a shift from military power to economic and technological sophistication. Let yourself relax as we explore the Song Dynasty's economic revolution, for this was a period of urbanization and commercial expansion unprecedented in world history at that time. Cities grew enormously, with the Song capital Kaifeng reaching a population of over 1 million, possibly making it the first city in history to exceed this threshold. Urban culture flourished with restaurants, theaters, markets, and entertainment districts that operated day and night. The Song government issued the world's first paper money, called jiaozi, to facilitate the massive expansion of trade that had made copper coins too heavy and cumbersome for large transactions. Agricultural innovations, including new fast-ripening rice varieties imported from Vietnam, allowed farmers to grow multiple crops per year, dramatically increasing food production and supporting the growing urban population. Iron production reached levels that wouldn't be matched by European nations until the 18th century. The Song dynasty represented a commercial and technological revolution that transformed China from an agrarian society into a sophisticated urban economy. Now, breathe slowly and contemplate the artistic and intellectual achievements of the Song dynasty. This period saw the development of Neo-Confucianism, a philosophical movement that reinterpreted classical Confucian teachings while incorporating elements from Buddhism and Taoism. Scholars like Zhu Xi created comprehensive philosophical systems that addressed metaphysical questions Confucius had largely avoided, providing Chinese intellectuals with the sophisticated worldview that would dominate Chinese thought for the next 8 centuries. Song Dynasty landscape painting reached sublime heights, with artists like Fan Quan and Guo Shi creating monumental works depicting mountains, rivers, and mist in ways that captured not just physical appearance, but spiritual essence. Calligraphy was refined to new levels of elegance and expressiveness. The Song Dynasty also saw advances in astronomy, mathematics, architecture, and medicine, as Chinese scholars systematically studied the natural world and preserved their findings in encyclopedic texts that transmitted knowledge across generations. Let your mind drift to the northern threat that would ultimately overwhelm the Song Dynasty: the Mongols, led by Genghis Khan, whose name means universal ruler. These nomadic warriors from the steppes north of China began conquering a vast empire in the early 13th century. Genghis Khan united the fractious Mongol tribes in 1206 and launched campaigns that would eventually create the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary and from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. The Mongols were brilliant cavalry warriors and ruthless conquerors who offered their enemies a stark choice: surrender and be spared, or resist and be annihilated. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his descendants continued expanding the empire. His grandson Kublai Khan focused on conquering China, a campaign that took decades. The Song Dynasty mounted fierce resistance, but Mongol military superiority, particularly in siege warfare, eventually prevailed. In 1279, the last Song emperor, a child, drowned when his fleet was defeated, and China came under foreign rule for the first time in its history. Breathe deeply as we explore the Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan in 1271, which ruled China until 1368. The Mongols maintained their distinct identity, keeping themselves separate from their Chinese subjects through a rigid social hierarchy that placed Mongols at the top, followed by other non-Chinese peoples, then Northern Chinese, and finally Southern Chinese at the bottom. Despite this discrimination, the Yuan dynasty brought some benefits to China. The Mongol Empire's vast extent meant that the Silk Road was safer than ever before, enabling unprecedented trade and cultural exchange between East and West. It was during the Yuan dynasty that the Venetian merchant Marco Polo allegedly traveled to China, though his actual presence there is debated by historians. His book describing the wonders of Kublai Khan's court fascinated Europeans and stimulated Western interest in Asia. The Yuan dynasty also saw the flourishing of Chinese drama and the development of new literary forms, as Chinese intellectuals, barred from the traditional paths to government service by Mongol discrimination, turned to arts and literature instead. The Yuan dynasty's rule was harsh and exploitative, with heavy taxation and discrimination fueling resentment among the Chinese population. By the mid-14th century, a series of natural disasters, floods, droughts, and plague, combined with government incompetence to spark rebellions across China. One rebel leader, Zhu Yuanzhang, emerged from humble origins as the son of poor farmers to become the leader of a successful uprising. In 1368, his forces captured the Yuan capital at Beijing, driving the Mongols back to the steppes and ending foreign rule. Zhu Yuanzhang declared himself emperor, founding the Ming dynasty and taking the reign name Hongwu, meaning vast military power. The Ming dynasty would rule China for nearly 3 centuries, from 1368 to 1644, restoring Chinese rule and ushering in a new era of stability, prosperity, and cultural achievement that would see China become one of the most powerful and advanced civilizations on Earth. As you sink into deeper rest, imagine the transition from Mongol to Ming, the collapse of the great empire, Chinese rebels storming city walls, the last Mongol emperor fleeing northward into the endless steppes, and rising from the chaos, a new dynasty founded by a peasant who became emperor, bringing Chinese rule back to Chinese lands, restoring traditions that had been suppressed, and building a civilization that would endure for 300 years. Let your breathing deepen as we explore one of history's most remarkable maritime expeditions, the voyages of Admiral Zheng He during the early Ming Dynasty. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who rose to become the emperor's most trusted admiral, led 7 massive naval expeditions across the Indian Ocean, visiting Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, Arabia, and the east coast of Africa. His fleets were extraordinary. The largest expedition included over 300 ships and nearly 28,000 men. The treasure ships, the largest vessels in the fleet, were enormous by the standards of the time, reportedly measuring over 400 feet long, dwarfing the ships Columbus would sail decades later. These expeditions were not about conquest, but about projecting Chinese power and prestige, establishing tributary relationships, and gathering exotic goods and knowledge. Zheng He brought back giraffes from Africa, which caused sensations at the Chinese court, along with countless other treasures. Yet after the 7th voyage, China abruptly ended these expeditions, turning inward and abandoning its maritime ambitions, a decision that some historians believe altered the course of world history by leaving maritime exploration to European powers. Now, let your thoughts drift to the construction of the Forbidden City in Beijing, the imperial palace complex that served as the home of Chinese emperors for nearly 5 centuries. Construction began in 1406 under Emperor Yongle, the same emperor who sponsored Zheng He's voyages, and was largely completed by 1420, though modifications continued throughout the Ming and Qing dynasties. The complex covers 180 acres and contains 980 surviving buildings with over 8,700 rooms, making it the largest palace complex in the world. The Forbidden City was designed according to principles of Chinese cosmology and feng shui, with buildings arranged along a north-south axis, painted in red and gold to represent power and prosperity, and topped with yellow glazed tiles, a color reserved for the emperor. The complex was called forbidden because entry was restricted. Ordinary people were not allowed inside on pain of death, and even high officials could only enter when summoned. The Forbidden City represented the center of the Chinese world, the emperor's cosmic mandate to rule, and the majesty of imperial power expressed through architecture. Breathe slowly and picture the Ming Dynasty's reconstruction of the Great Wall, creating the structure we recognize today. While earlier dynasties had built various defensive walls, the Ming Dynasty undertook the most extensive wall-building project in Chinese history, driven by the constant threat of Mongol invasions from the north. The Ming Dynasty extended, rebuilt, and fortified the wall with brick and stone rather than the tamped earth of earlier constructions, adding watchtowers, garrison stations, and beacon towers for signaling. The wall as we know it today, stretching approximately 13,000 miles, including all branches and extensions, is primarily a Ming creation, built over 2 centuries at tremendous cost in resources and human labor. Despite its massive scale, the wall's effectiveness as a military defense was limited. Determined invaders could often find ways through, over, or around it. The Great Wall's true significance lies not in its military value, but in what it represents: the immense organizational capacity of the Chinese state. the determination to defend Chinese civilization from external threats, and the enduring symbol of Chinese cultural identity. Let yourself relax as we explore the arrival of Europeans in East Asia and the beginning of sustained contact between China and the West. Portuguese traders reached the Chinese coast in the early 16th century, establishing a permanent settlement at Macau in 1557. They were followed by Spanish, Dutch, and eventually British traders, all seeking access to Chinese goods, particularly silk, porcelain, and tea, which were highly prized in Europe. The Ming Dynasty restricted foreign trade to specific ports and controlled it through the tribute system, where foreign nations were theoretically required to acknowledge Chinese superiority and present tribute to the emperor in exchange for trade privileges. European traders also brought Christian missionaries, particularly Jesuits like Matteo Ricci, who arrived in China in 1582. Ricci learned Chinese, adopted Chinese dress and customs, and impressed Chinese scholars with his knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and cartography. He and other Jesuit missionaries introduced Western scientific knowledge to China while transmitting knowledge of Chinese culture, philosophy, and technology back to Europe, creating one of the first sustained intellectual exchanges between Chinese and European civilizations. Now, breathe deeply and contemplate the late Ming Dynasty's troubles, which began to accumulate in the early 17th century. Climate change during what historians call the Little Ice Age caused crop failures and famines. Incompetent emperors and corrupt officials mismanaged the government. The burden of maintaining the Great Wall and defending against raiders drained the treasury. Most seriously, a new threat emerged from the northeast. The Manchu people, descendants of the Jurchen tribes, who had once ruled northern China centuries earlier. The Manchus organized themselves into a powerful military force, adopting Chinese administrative practices while maintaining their martial traditions. Meanwhile, internal rebellions weakened the Ming Dynasty further. In 1644, a rebel leader named Li Zicheng captured Beijing, and the last Ming Emperor Chongzhen hanged himself on a hill behind the Forbidden City, ending the Ming Dynasty. However, Li Zicheng's triumph was short-lived. Ming generals, preferring Manchu rule to rebel rule, invited the Manchus to help suppress the rebellion. The Manchus did so, and then stayed, establishing their own dynasty. Let your mind drift to the Qing Dynasty, China's last imperial dynasty, founded by the Manchus in 1644 and lasting until 1912. The Qing Dynasty would rule China for 268 years, longer than any other conquest dynasty. The Manchus were a minority population ruling over the vast Han Chinese majority, and they employed various strategies to maintain control. They imposed the Q hairstyle on Chinese men, shaving the front of the head and braiding the hair in the back, as a symbol of submission to Manchu rule, making it a capital offense to refuse. They maintained the distinction between Manchus and Han Chinese through laws that preserved Manchu identity, language, and privileges. However, the Qing also adopted Chinese governmental structures, retained Chinese officials, and presented themselves as legitimate inheritors of the mandate of heaven, successfully blending Manchu military power with Chinese administrative tradition. Under capable early emperors like Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, the Qing dynasty expanded China's territory to its greatest extent, conquering Mongolia, Tibet, and Central Asian territories, creating a multi-ethnic empire that encompassed more than just China proper. Breathe slowly as we explore the reign of Emperor Kangxi, who ruled for 61 years from 1661 to 1722. one of the longest reigns in Chinese history. Kangxi came to the throne as a child and grew into one of China's most capable rulers. He pacified rebellions, expanded the empire's borders, sponsored massive scholarly projects, including an enormous dictionary that standardized Chinese characters, and patronized both Chinese and Manchu culture. Kangxi was intellectually curious, learning mathematics and astronomy from Jesuit missionaries, while also being a devoted student of Chinese classics. He personally led military campaigns, toured his realm extensively to inspect conditions, and worked tirelessly at governance. His reign, along with those of his son Yongzheng and grandson Qianlong, represented what historians call the Hai Qing, a period of prosperity, territorial expansion, and cultural achievement. By the mid-18th century, under Emperor Qianlong, the Qing Empire was at its zenith, controlling an enormous territory, enjoying unprecedented prosperity, and presiding over a population that had grown to over 300 million people, making China the wealthiest and most powerful state in the world. Yet even at this height, seeds of future troubles were being sown. The Tang Dynasty's attitude toward foreign trade and diplomacy would soon clash with aggressive European imperialism. In 1793, the British sent Lord Macartney on a mission to Emperor Qianlong, seeking to establish diplomatic relations and expand trade. The emperor rejected the British requests, famously writing to King George III that we possess all things and had no need for British-manufactured goods. This dismissive attitude reflected China's self-perception as the center of civilization, requiring nothing from the outside world. Within a few decades, this attitude would prove catastrophic, as European nations, particularly Britain, would use military force to pry open Chinese markets and impose humiliating treaties on the Tang Dynasty, beginning China's century of humiliation that would transform Chinese society and eventually lead to the dynasty's collapse and the birth of modern China. As you rest in complete peace, imagine Tang Dynasty China at its height, the vast forbidden city gleaming under the sun, the emperor surrounded by officials in brilliant silk robes, scholars in academies studying ancient texts while simultaneously learning Western astronomy, farmers working fields that stretched to every horizon, and at the borders of the empire, the first stirrings of conflicts that would eventually shatter this ancient world and force China into a painful confrontation with modernity. Let your breathing slow as we explore the Opium Wars, conflicts that mark the beginning of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. By the early 19th century, Britain had developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, but China had little interest in British goods, creating a massive trade imbalance. To correct this, British merchants began smuggling opium grown in British India into China, creating millions of addicts and draining silver from the Chinese economy. When the Qing government tried to suppress the opium trade by confiscating and destroying opium stocks in 1839, Britain responded with military force. The First Opium War, lasting from 1839 to 1842, demonstrated the technological gap that had opened between China and the industrialized West. British steam-powered warships and modern artillery devastated Chinese defenses. The Treaty of Nanking that ended the war forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 ports to foreign trade, pay enormous indemnities, and grant extraterritoriality to British citizens, meaning they would be tried under British rather than Chinese law. This treaty was the first of what the Chinese call the unequal treaties that would strip away Chinese sovereignty piece by piece. Now, let your thoughts drift to the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, which erupted in southern China in 1850. Hong Xiuquan, a failed civil service examination candidate who had experienced visions after reading Christian missionary tracts, declared himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ and launched a religious and political movement to overthrow the Tang Dynasty and establish the heavenly kingdom of great peace. The Taiping rebels captured Nanjing in 1853 and established their capital there, controlling much of southern China. The rebellion combined Christianity with Chinese traditions, banned opium and foot binding, promoted land redistribution, and advocated gender equality in radical ways. The Tang Dynasty, with help from Western powers who feared the rebellion would disrupt trade, eventually suppressed the Taiping after 14 years of brutal warfare. The rebellion and its suppression cost an estimated 20 to 30 million lives, making it one of the deadliest conflicts ever, devastating southern China and demonstrating the Tang Dynasty's weakness and inability to maintain order without foreign assistance. Breathe deeply and picture the self-strengthening movement, China's first major attempt at modernization in response to repeated military defeats. Beginning in the 1860s, Chinese reformers argued that China needed to adopt Western military technology and industrial methods while preserving traditional Chinese values and culture. Chinese learning for fundamental principles, Western learning for practical application. The movement established arsenals, shipyards, and modern weapons factories, sent students abroad to study Western science and technology, and attempted to build railways and telegraph lines. However, the movement achieved limited success, hampered by conservative opposition, inadequate funding, official corruption, and the difficulty of adopting Western technology without also transforming the political and social systems that supported it. The failure of self-strengthening became clear in 1895 when China was decisively defeated by Japan, a nation that had once learned from China but had modernized far more successfully. In the First Sino-Japanese War, this humiliating defeat by a neighbor China had long considered inferior shock Chinese intellectuals and made clear that superficial reforms were insufficient. Let yourself relax as we explore the 100 Days Reform of 1898, a brief but significant attempt at radical political transformation. The young Emperor Guangxu, influenced by reformist scholars like Kang Yuwei and Liang Qichao, issued over 40 edicts in just 103 days, attempting to modernize Chinese government, education, military, and economy. The reforms proposed establishing a constitutional monarchy, reforming the examination system to emphasize practical knowledge rather than classical texts, establishing modern schools and universities, and creating new governmental institutions. However, these reforms threatened the privileges of conservative officials and the power of Empress Dowager Cixi, the emperor's aunt who had effectively controlled the government for decades. Cixi staged a coup, placed the emperor under house arrest where he would remain until his death, executed 6 of the leading reformers, and reversed most of the reforms. The 100 Days Reform demonstrated both the desire for change among progressive Chinese intellectuals and the powerful forces resisting modernization. Now breathe slowly and contemplate the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, an anti-foreign, anti-Christian uprising that reflected popular fury at foreign domination and cultural intrusion. The Boxers, members of a martial arts society called the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, believed their rituals made them invulnerable to bullets. They attacked Chinese Christians and foreign missionaries, destroyed railways and telegraph lines, and eventually, with the tacit support of Empress Dowager Cixi, laid siege to the foreign legations in Beijing. 8 foreign powers, including Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and the United States, organized a joint military expedition that captured Beijing, defeated the Boxers, and forced the Qing government to pay massive indemnities. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposed humiliating terms on China, including the execution of officials who had supported the Boxers, foreign troops stationed in Beijing, and indemnities so large they would take decades to repay. The rebellion's failure demonstrated that xenophobia and traditional methods could not restore Chinese power, and that more fundamental changes were necessary. Let your mind drift to the fall of the Tang Dynasty and the end of over 2,000 years of imperial rule. In the early 20th century, revolutionary movements spread across China, influenced by Republican ideals, nationalism, and the conviction that the Tang Dynasty could not save China. Sun Yat-sen, a Western-educated physician, became the most prominent revolutionary leader, advocating his 3 principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. On October 10, 1911, a military uprising in Wuchang sparked a chain reaction of provincial declarations of independence from Qing rule. The revolution spread rapidly, and within months, most of China had abandoned the dynasty. The 6-year-old Emperor Hui, the last emperor of China, abdicated on February 12, 1912, bringing the Qing dynasty and the entire imperial system to an end. Sun Yat-sen became the provisional president of the new Republic of China, marking the beginning of a new era in Chinese history. However, the republic would prove fragile, quickly falling under the control of military strongmen and descending into warlordism, demonstrating that overthrowing an old system was far easier than building a stable new one. Breathe deeply as we explore the Chinese Republic's early struggles. Yuan Shikai, a powerful military leader, soon marginalized Sun Yat-sen and became president, ruling as a dictator and even attempting to declare himself emperor before dying in 1916. His death left China without strong central government, fragmenting into regions controlled by competing warlords who maintained private armies and fought each other for territory and resources. During this chaotic period, China experienced intense intellectual ferment as scholars and students debated how to save Chinese civilization. The May 4th movement of 1919, sparked by anger at the Treaty of Versailles, which transferred German concessions in China to Japan rather than returning them to Chinese control, became a watershed moment in Chinese cultural and political transformation. Students protested in Beijing, demanding political change and cultural renewal. Intellectuals called for science and democracy, criticized Confucian tradition as responsible for China's weakness, and promoted vernacular Chinese literature over classical forms. This cultural revolution laid the groundwork for the political transformations that would follow. The final fact to contemplate as you drift into the deepest sleep concerns the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921, an event that would ultimately determine China's future. In the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, and with the support of the Soviet Union's Comintern, 13 delegates, including a young librarian named Mao Zedong, met secretly in Shanghai to establish the Communist Party of China. Initially a tiny organization, the party grew by organizing workers, peasants, and intellectuals around promises of land reform, national independence, and social justice. The Communists initially allied with Sun Yat-sen's Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, in an effort to reunify China, but after Sun's death in 1925, the Nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek turned against the Communists in 1927, beginning a civil war that would continue. interrupted by the Japanese invasion and World War II, until 1949. The communist victory and the establishment of the People's Republic of China would mark yet another transformation in China's long history, bringing China from its imperial past through the turmoil of the 20th century and into the modern era, where the ancient civilization continues to evolve, adapting to new challenges while drawing on 4,000 years of continuous cultural tradition that has survived every dynasty's rise and fall, every invasion and rebellion, every triumph and catastrophe. As you rest in the deepest tranquility, let the vast sweep of Chinese history wash over you like the waters of the Yellow River and the Yangtze. For millennia of civilization, countless generations rising and falling like waves, dynasties succeeding one another in the eternal cycle of the mandate of heaven, philosophers teaching wisdom that echoes across centuries, inventions that changed the world, art and literature that captured the human spirit, and through it all, the endurance of Chinese civilization, bending but never breaking, adapting but never losing its essential character, flowing forward like those two great rivers through the heart of China, carrying the past into the present and onward into the unknown future.